My name is Maya, and I'm 32 years old. Suddenly, my husband became very attentive and prepared a special breakfast for me because I had severe morning sickness. But something felt wrong. Deep in my gut, something screamed danger. So I gave it to his personal secretary. 1 hour later, she let out a blood-curdling scream that changed everything. Everything. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment below which city you're watching from. Your support means everything to me. Now let's get back to the story. That morning started like any other morning in downtown Atlanta. I arrived at my executive office at 7:30, just as the sun was beginning to paint the skyline in shades of gold and pink. I was the marketing director for a successful tech firm, a position I'd worked my entire adult life to achieve. The mahogany desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Peachtree Street, the corner office with my name on the door. I'd earned every single inch of it. But that morning, success was the last thing on my mind. All I could think about was the nausea rolling through my stomach in violent waves. I was 10 weeks pregnant, 10 weeks of secretly carrying a child that I wasn't sure I even wanted to tell my husband about anymore. Because for the past 8 months, DeAndre had become a stranger. The man I married 4 years ago, the man who used to wake me up with kisses and coffee, who used to hold me close and whisper promises about our future, that man had vanished. In his place was someone cold, someone distant, someone who came home late smelling like perfume that wasn't mine and made excuses that didn't quite add up. I sat down at my desk, pulling out the files for the morning's presentation when my office door swung open without a knock. That should have been my first warning. DeAndre never came to my office. We worked in the same building, him on the executive floor, me 2 levels down, but we maintained professional distance at work. That's what we'd always agreed on. But there he was, walking through my door with this expensive thermal food container in his hands. It was one of those high-end Japanese brands, gleaming stainless steel, the kind that costs $200 and keeps food hot for 12 hours. I'd never seen it before. We didn't own one. And he was smiling. Lord, he was smiling this bright, the wide smile that I hadn't seen in months. It was the smile he used to give me when we were dating, when he'd surprise me with flowers or plan secret weekend getaways. But now, that smile sent chills down my spine because it felt wrong. It felt like a mask, like he was performing happiness instead of feeling it. He walked over to my desk and set the container down with this gentle thud, and then he looked at me with those dark brown eyes and said the words that would haunt me forever. He told me good morning, called me baby, mentioned our anniversary was coming up, said he wanted to do something special, that he'd noticed I looked pale lately, that work was stressing me out, that he'd gotten up before dawn to slow cook something for me, something to help me get my strength back. My favorite food, he said, to eat it while it was hot. I stared at that container like it was a snake coiled on my desk. Something about the whole situation felt staged, felt calculated. DeAndre hadn't cooked for me in over a year. He barely spoke to me at home anymore. We lived like roommates who happened to share a bed, turning our backs to each other in the darkness, building walls between us with silence. And suddenly he was up at dawn cooking elaborate meals, playing the doting husband. My instincts were screaming, but I tried to be gracious. I tried to smile and thank him. I told him I'd already eaten at home, that I was full, that maybe I'd save it for lunch. But he pushed. He insisted. He moved the container closer to me, telling me he'd spent all morning preparing it, that I shouldn't let his effort go to waste. And there was something in his voice, something underneath the sweetness that felt like pressure, like a threat wrapped in concern. Then he opened the lid. The smell hit me like a physical force, rich, heavy, pungent. It was stew, some kind of meat stew with spices and peppers, and under normal circumstances, maybe it would have smelled delicious. But I was pregnant. My stomach was already churning, and that smell made everything worse. I felt bile rising in my throat. I gripped the edge of my desk, trying not to gag, trying to smile through the nausea, and I kept insisting I couldn't eat right now. DeAndre's face changed. Just for a second. The smile froze, and I saw something flash in his eyes. Anger? Frustration? Fear? I couldn't tell. But he recovered quickly, smoothing his expression back into that fake warmth, and he told me to at least try a little. That he'd worked so hard, that I shouldn't disrespect him like this. Disrespect. That's the word he used. As if refusing breakfast was some kind of betrayal. I was saved by a knock on my door. Brianna walked in, my secretary, this 26-year-old woman with smooth brown skin and curves that she made sure everyone noticed. She'd been hired 8 months ago. 8 months. The exact same time DeAndre started pulling away from me. Coincidence? I didn't think so. I'd noticed the way she looked at him in meetings, the way she touched his arm when she laughed at his jokes, the way her eyes would light up whenever he walked into a room, and I'd noticed the way he looked back. She came in carrying some documents, wearing this tight pencil skirt and a silk blouse that left little to the imagination, and she immediately zeroed in on DeAndre. She smiled at him, all flirtatious and warm, and then she looked at the food container and made some comment about how thoughtful he was, what a lucky woman I was, how I had a perfect 10 of a husband that no one could compete with. The words felt like knives, because I knew. Deep in my soul, I knew there was something between them. The energy in the room shifted when they were together. The air got thick with unspoken words and stolen glances, and in that moment, watching her look at my husband with hunger in her eyes, watching him avoid my gaze, I made a decision. I smiled at Brianna, sweet as honey, and I told her I'd just eaten and couldn't possibly finish this delicious meal DeAndre had prepared. I asked if she'd had breakfast. I pushed the container toward her, telling her DeAndre's cooking was amazing, that she should try it, that it would be a shame for all his hard work to go to waste. The words came out smooth, casual, like I was just being generous, but inside, my heart was pounding, because some instinct, some deep primal warning system was telling me to get that food away from me, to not let a single drop touch my lips. Brianna's face lit up like Christmas morning. She looked at DeAndre, checking for permission, and I saw it. I saw the panic flash across his face. Just for a split second, his mask slipped, and I saw pure terror in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by this tight smile and a slight nod. He didn't object. He didn't stop her. He just stood there with his jaw clenched and watched as Brianna grabbed that container like it was made of gold. She thanked me so enthusiastically, telling me she'd eat every bite, that she was sure anything the boss cooked would be incredible. Then she hugged that container to her chest and practically skipped out of my office. DeAndre followed without another word to me. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't kiss my forehead like he used to. Just walked out with his shoulders tense and his hands balled into fists. I sat there alone, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. Relief that I hadn't eaten that food. Relief mixed with confusion and growing dread. Why did I feel like I just dodged a bullet? Why did my husband look terrified when someone else took the meal he'd supposedly prepared with love? What the hell was happening in my marriage? I tried to focus on work. I opened my laptop, pulled up spreadsheets, reviewed the marketing campaign we were launching next week, but I couldn't concentrate. My hands were shaking. I poured myself a glass of water and took small sips, one hand unconsciously moving to my stomach, to the tiny life growing inside me, a life I hadn't told DeAndre about yet because I wasn't sure if I wanted him to be part of this journey anymore, because I wasn't sure who he was anymore. An hour passed, maybe a little more. I was deep into analyzing conversion rates when I heard it. A crash, loud, like something heavy falling to the floor in the hallway outside my office. And then the scream. Oh God, the scream. It wasn't a normal scream. It wasn't someone startled or scared. It was a sound of pure agony, a blood-curdling, soul-destroying scream that made every hair on my body stand up. It was the sound of someone dying. I jumped up from my desk so fast my chair rolled back and hit the wall. My heart was in my throat. My hands went numb. I ran to my door and yanked it open, and the sight that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my life. Brianna was on the floor, convulsing. Her body was twisted at an unnatural angle, jerking and spasming like she was being electrocuted. The breakfast container was overturned next to her. Stew spilled everywhere across the industrial carpet. The smell was overwhelming now, mixing with something else, something bitter and wrong. Brianna was clutching her stomach with both hands, and her fingers were digging into her flesh so hard I could see her nails breaking through the fabric of her blouse. But it was the blood that froze me in place. Blood was pooling underneath her, spreading out in this dark crimson stain that kept growing and growing. Her cream-colored blouse was soaked through. Her skin had gone gray. Her eyes were rolling back in her head, showing the whites, and there was foam coming from her mouth. White foam mixed with bile. She was making these horrible choking sounds, gasping for air that wouldn't come. People were running from all directions, employees screaming, someone shouting to call 911, everyone in panic mode. I just stood there in my doorway, paralyzed, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. Brianna was dying. Right there on the floor of our office, she was dying. And I had given her that food. I had pushed that container toward her. I had smiled and encouraged her to eat every bite. My knees went weak. I grabbed the door frame to keep from collapsing. My mind was racing. What was in that food? What could do this to someone? And then the thought hit me like a freight train. That was supposed to be me. I had been the target. DeAndre had brought that breakfast for me. He'd insisted I eat it. He'd pushed and pressured and practically begged me to consume whatever was in that container. And if it wasn't for my morning sickness, if it wasn't for that instinct that told me to give it away, I would be the one on that floor right now. I would be the one convulsing and bleeding and dying while my coworkers watched in horror. The office doors burst open and DeAndre came running out. But he didn't run to Brianna. He didn't kneel down to help her or ask what happened or call for a doctor. He stopped dead in his tracks about 10 feet away from her body, and he just stared at the blood, stared at her twisted form, and I watched his face cycle through emotions like flipping channels on a TV. Shock, then fear, then something that looked like disappointment, and finally, rage. He lifted his head and his eyes locked onto mine, and I'm telling you, I have never seen such hatred in someone's eyes before. This wasn't the look of a husband worried about his wife witnessing something traumatic. This wasn't the face of a boss concerned for his employee. This was the look of a predator who just watched his prey escape. This was the face of a killer realizing his plan had failed. He stormed toward me, crossed that hallway in 4 long strides, and grabbed my arm so hard I cried out. His fingers dug into my skin like vices. He pulled me close, his face inches from mine, and he hissed through clenched teeth, asked me what I had done, asked me why. Why her and not me? Let me repeat that. He asked why her and not me, as if he'd expected me to be the one dying on the floor, as if the whole scene was wrong because the wrong woman was bleeding out. Something in me snapped. The fear transformed into fury. I ripped my arm out of his grasp, and I felt my nails scratch his skin as I pulled away. I looked him dead in the eye, and I asked him what he was thinking. I asked if he'd expected it to be me on that floor. I asked what he'd put in the food that he cooked, that he brought to my office, that he insisted I eat. DeAndre froze. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He realized he'd said too much, revealed too much. His mask had completely shattered, and standing before me was a stranger, a dangerous stranger who'd just tried to kill me and failed. The ambulance sirens were wailing up from the street below. I could hear the paramedics rushing through the building lobby. The sound cut through the horrible tension between us. DeAndre stepped back from me, ran his hand over his face like he was trying to wipe away the evidence of his guilt, and I saw his hands shaking, actually trembling. The paramedics burst onto our floor with a stretcher and medical equipment. They immediately went to work on Brianna, checking her vitals, starting an IV, asking questions nobody could answer. What did she ingest? When? How much? Everyone was talking at once, chaos everywhere, but I couldn't stop staring at DeAndre, and he couldn't stop staring at me with those eyes full of threats and hatred. They loaded Brianna onto the stretcher and rushed her to the elevator. DeAndre followed them. But before the elevator doors closed, he turned back to look at me one more time. He pointed his finger at me like a weapon, and he told me I had to come to the hospital too, that this happened because of the food I gave her, that I couldn't dodge my responsibility. My responsibility. The audacity. The absolute nerve of this man to try to blame me for his crime, to try to make me feel guilty for surviving his murder attempt. I watched those elevator doors close, and I felt something inside me die. The last remnants of love I had for DeAndre, the last shred of hope that our marriage could be saved, it all crumbled to dust. The man I'd loved, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my life and my future, had just tried to kill me, had tried to kill our unborn child. And when his plan failed, when someone else suffered instead, he had the nerve to look at me with disappointment and rage. I stumbled back into my office and closed the door. My legs gave out and I slid down to the floor, my back against the wall, and I wrapped my arms around my knees. The reality was sinking in, heavy and suffocating. That breakfast wasn't an anniversary gift. It wasn't a gesture of love or care. It was attempted murder, premeditated, calculated murder. DeAndre had gotten up before dawn, had spent hours preparing poison disguised as food, had brought it to my office with that fake smile and those empty words, and he'd fully intended for me to die today. I put my hand on my stomach, feeling the slight curve that wasn't visible yet through my clothes. 10 weeks. This little life inside me was 10 weeks old, and someone had just tried to end it before it even had a chance to begin. My baby's own father had tried to murder them. The thought made me want to vomit, made me want to scream, made me want to burn the entire world down. But I couldn't fall apart. Not yet, because I knew what was coming next. DeAndre was going to try to blame me. He was going to paint me as the jealous wife who poisoned her husband's secretary out of spite. He was going to twist this whole situation to protect himself, and if I didn't stay sharp, if I didn't stay smart, he was going to get away with it. I stood up, wiped my eyes, straightened my clothes. I looked at my reflection in the window, at the woman staring back at me with red eyes and a clenched jaw. This was war now, and I was going to win. I grabbed my phone and called the one person I knew I could trust, Keisha, my assistant, my friend, the woman who'd been with me since I started at this company 5 years ago. She answered on the first ring, her voice frantic, asking if I was okay, if I'd seen what happened. I told her I needed her. I needed her to pull every security camera recording from this morning. Every angle, every timestamp, everything. I told her someone was going to try to pin this on me, and I needed evidence of my innocence. Keisha didn't ask questions. She just said she'd handle it and hung up. That's the kind of loyalty I'm talking about, real loyalty. Not the fake kind DeAndre had been pretending to give me for years while he plotted my death. Then I called my lawyer. Yes, I had a lawyer on speed dial. When you're a successful black woman in corporate America, you learn to keep legal protection close. I told him what happened. Told him I needed to meet with him before I went to the hospital. Told him my husband just tried to kill me and I needed to know my rights. He told me to come to his office immediately, to not speak to the police without him present, to not sign anything, admit anything, or let anyone intimidate me into a confession. I grabbed my purse, checked my appearance one more time, and left my office. The hallway was still marked with Brianna's blood. Maintenance hadn't arrived yet to clean it up. The dark stain on the carpet was a brutal reminder of how close I'd come to death. I walked around it, careful not to step in it, feeling sick to my stomach but forcing myself to stay strong. Employees stared at me as I walked to the elevator. I could hear the whispers starting already, the rumors spreading like wildfire. Did she do it? Did Maya poison Brianna? I heard they were fighting over Maya's husband. I heard Maya found out about the affair and snapped. The gossip was beginning, the narrative being constructed, and I knew it was only going to get worse. Let them talk. Let them speculate. The truth was going to come out, and when it did, every single person in this building would know exactly what kind of monster DeAndre Williams really was. I met with my lawyer for 45 minutes. He took notes, asked pointed questions, and his face got grimmer and grimmer as I told him everything. The sudden attention from DeAndre after months of distance, the expensive food container I'd never seen before, his insistence that I eat, his reaction when Brianna collapsed, his accusatory questions. The lawyer looked at me over his glasses and told me in no uncertain terms that DeAndre had tried to kill me, that this wasn't paranoia or speculation, that based on what I'd described, I was the target, and I needed to cooperate fully with police while protecting myself legally. He also told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that if Brianna died, and if the police found poison in that food, DeAndre would likely try to claim I had the means and opportunity to tamper with it, that I'd been alone with the container for an hour before giving it to Brianna, that he'd try to paint me as the jealous, unstable wife who couldn't handle her husband's affair. The word affair hung in the air between us. My lawyer apologized for being blunt, but I waved him off. I wasn't naive. I'd known about DeAndre and Brianna for months. I'd seen the signs, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the smell of her perfume on his clothes, the way he'd stopped touching me, stopped looking at me, stopped caring whether I existed or not. I'd known. I just hadn't wanted to accept it. My lawyer gave me his card, told me to call him the second police wanted to question me, and sent me on my way to the hospital. I drove there in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Grady Memorial Hospital. The same hospital where I'd found out I was pregnant 6 weeks ago, where I'd sat in the waiting room alone staring at those 2 pink lines on the test, wondering if I should be happy or terrified, wondering if bringing a child into my broken marriage was fair to anyone. Now I was driving back there because my husband's mistress was dying from the poison he'd meant for me. The irony was almost funny. Almost. I parked in the garage and walked through the automatic doors into the emergency room. The fluorescent lights were too bright, sterile, and harsh. The smell of disinfectant mixed with fear and sickness. I hated hospitals, hated everything about them. The waiting, the uncertainty, the way time seemed to move differently inside these walls. DeAndre was there in the waiting area, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His expensive suit was wrinkled now, his tie was loose, his hair was disheveled. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. Good. I hoped he was suffering. I hoped every second felt like torture. When he saw me walk in, he stopped pacing. Our eyes met across the room, and I felt the hatred radiating off him like heat. But he didn't approach me. He just stood there, watching me with those dead eyes, probably running through his options, trying to figure out how to spin this disaster into something he could survive. I sat down in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs as far from DeAndre as possible. I interlaced my fingers to stop them from shaking. My whole body was trembling with rage and fear and adrenaline. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run over there and claw his eyes out. I wanted to know why. Why did he want me dead? Why did he want our baby dead? What had I done to deserve this? How long had he been planning it? But I stayed quiet, stayed still, because I knew this was a game now, and I couldn't afford to lose control. The emergency room doors swung open, and a middle-aged doctor walked out. He looked exhausted. He pulled down his surgical mask, and his face was grave, serious. DeAndre rushed toward him like he'd been shot out of a cannon, asking how Brianna was, if it was serious, if she was going to be okay. His voice cracked with emotion, and I wanted to laugh. This man was such a good actor, such a convincing liar. I stood up and walked over slowly, my heels clicking on the tile floor. The doctor looked between the two of us, and I could see him trying to figure out our relationship, why we were both here, what our connection was to the victim. The doctor's words were careful, measured. He said Brianna had suffered acute poisoning, that they'd gotten to her in time, that she was out of danger, but it was close, too close. He explained that the substance found in her system was misoprostol, a drug used to induce uterine contractions, used to facilitate labor or induce abortions. And the dose in Brianna's system was massive, intentional. This wasn't food poisoning. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate poisoning with a very specific drug that had a very specific purpose. I felt my knees buckle. Misoprostol, an abortion drug. DeAndre had tried to kill my baby with an abortion drug disguised as breakfast. The calculation of it. the cruelty. My hand went to my stomach instinctively, protectively. My baby was still there, still safe, still alive, but only because I'd given that food to someone else. The doctor continued, his voice getting more serious. He said that because of the extremely high dose and the clear intent to harm, they'd followed protocol and contacted the police, that officers were on their way to take statements and begin an investigation. DeAndre's face went white, completely drained of color. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I watched him try to process this information, watched him realize that he wasn't going to be able to just walk away from this. The police were involved. There would be tests, evidence, questions. His perfect plan was falling apart, but then the doctor said something that made everything so much worse. He said the reason Brianna had such severe hemorrhaging, the reason she'd nearly died, was because the drug had caused violent uterine contractions, and following protocol, they'd done tests, blood work, and they'd found that Brianna had been pregnant, 8 weeks pregnant. But due to the massive dose of misoprostol, the fetus couldn't survive. They'd lost the baby. The silence that followed was deafening. I heard every word the doctor said, but it took a few seconds for the meaning to sink in. Brianna was pregnant, 8 weeks, with DeAndre's child. She'd been carrying his baby, and he had just killed it. He'd killed his own child with the poison he'd meant for mine. I looked at DeAndre and I saw the exact moment the reality hit him. His face went from white to gray to almost green. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened in this silent scream. His legs gave out and he collapsed into one of the waiting room chairs. His hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the armrests to keep them still. The doctor was still talking, explaining the medical details, but I couldn't hear him anymore. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. All I could think was, karma. Brutal, instant karma. DeAndre had tried to kill my baby, and instead he'd killed his own. The baby he'd been making with his mistress while he ignored me at home. The baby he probably didn't even know existed. Gone. Because of his own poison. Because of his own evil. 2 police officers appeared at the end of the hallway. They were in uniform, serious expressions, walking with purpose. They approached the doctor first, had a brief conversation, then turned their attention to us. The older officer, a black man with gray at his temples and kind eyes, asked us to cooperate with their investigation, to answer some questions, to help them figure out exactly what happened. And that's when DeAndre made his move. He stood up, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and tried to pull himself together. Tried to become the polished executive again, the respectable businessman, the victim of circumstances. He looked at the officers and he pointed at me, actually pointed his finger at me like I was a criminal, and he told them they needed to investigate thoroughly, that this morning he'd prepared a meal for his wife with love and care, that I'd had that container in my office for over an hour before giving it to Brianna, that he suspected I'd put something in it out of jealousy, out of spite, that I was mentally unstable and they needed to look into me. I felt rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. White-hot, blinding rage that made my vision go red. This man had just tried to murder me and our baby, and now he was standing there in front of police officers, trying to frame me for his crime. Trying to paint me as the villain in his twisted story, trying to send me to prison for his attempted murder. But I didn't explode. I didn't scream or cry or attack him. I took a deep breath, straightened my spine, and I looked at the older officer with complete calm, with complete control. And I told him I had no motive to do something like that you could check the security cameras in our building and see that I never left my office, never opened that container again after DeAndre left it with me, that they could check for fingerprints on any medicine bottles they found, and most importantly, that they should ask themselves why a meal my husband claimed he'd prepared to take care of me contained an abortion drug. Why would I put abortion drugs in my own food? Why would I try to kill a baby that I wanted? The officer nodded slowly, taking notes. I could see the wheels turning in his head. I could see him connecting the dots, because it didn't make sense. None of DeAndre's story made sense. Why would I poison food that was meant for me? why would I then give it to some random secretary? If I wanted to hurt Brianna, there were 1,000 easier ways. But if DeAndre wanted to hurt me and make it look like an accident, like a spontaneous miscarriage, then suddenly everything made perfect sense. The younger officer asked the doctor another question, something about Brianna's specific condition, about the effects of the drug, about timeline and symptoms, and the doctor's response was devastating. He said with regret that due to the massive dose, the violent contractions, and the hours of hemorrhaging, Brianna would never be able to have children again. The damage to her uterus was too severe. She was 26 years old, and her ability to become a mother had been destroyed forever. I heard a choking sound and looked over to see DeAndre with his hands over his face, shoulders shaking. He was crying, actually crying, but not for Brianna, not for the young woman whose life he'd ruined. He was crying for himself, for the male heir he'd lost, for the son that was confirmed dead while I carried a daughter he'd tried to kill. His family was old school, traditional, obsessed with having boys to carry on the family name, and he'd just accidentally murdered his own son while trying to murder my daughter. The poetic justice of it all was almost beautiful, almost enough to make me believe in divine intervention. The officers told us they'd need to question us separately to get our full statements, to understand the timeline of events. The older officer gestured for me to follow him to a quieter corner of the emergency room, away from DeAndre. He was gentle, professional, but I could see the suspicion in his eyes. He'd heard DeAndre's accusations. He had to at least consider the possibility that I was involved. So I told him everything. And I mean everything. I started from the beginning, from 8 months ago when DeAndre suddenly changed. When he started staying late at work, coming home with lipstick on his collar, smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. When he stopped touching me, stopped talking to me, stopped pretending to care whether I existed. I told the officer about Brianna being hired 8 months ago, about catching them looking at each other, about the way the energy changed when they were in the same room. I told him about this morning, about DeAndre showing up at my office with that container, something he'd never done before, about the expensive, brand-new thermal container I'd never seen, about his insistence that I eat, his pressure, his weird intensity about it. I explained about my morning sickness, about how I'd only opened the lid, seen the stew, immediately closed it because the smell made me nauseous. I emphasized that I never stirred it, never added anything, never touched the food itself. That when Brianna came in, flirting with DeAndre, I'd simply offered it to her because I couldn't eat it, and she seemed eager. The officer asked if DeAndre had objected when I gave the food to Brianna, and I told him yes. I told him about that flash of panic on DeAndre's face, that split second of terror before he masked it, how his whole body had gone tense, but he hadn't stopped it. He'd let it happen. Probably because stopping it would have been too suspicious, would have raised too many questions. On the other side of the emergency room, DeAndre was being questioned by the younger officer. I could see him gesturing wildly, pointing at me, his voice getting louder. He was insisting that he'd cooked the meal himself, that he'd gone to the market personally, prepared everything in our kitchen from scratch before dawn, that he was meticulous, that he never let anyone touch his wife's food, that from the moment he finished cooking until he brought it to my office, the container never left his possession, and that was his mistake. That was the lie that was going to bury him. Because if he was the only person who touched that food, if it never left his possession, if he prepared it himself and brought it directly to me, then he was the only person who could have put the poison in it. There was no other explanation. I couldn't have tampered with it because I never opened it properly. Brianna couldn't have added anything because she received it sealed. So that left only DeAndre, the loving husband who'd woken up early to slowly poison his wife to death. The officers exchanged glances. They stepped aside to confer quietly, looking back at us, comparing notes. I could see them putting together the pieces. I could see them reaching the same conclusion I had. And I saw the moment they decided who they believed. DeAndre must have seen it too because he jumped up, his voice rising to almost a shout. He started ranting about how they needed to investigate me thoroughly, how I'd been jealous lately, how I wasn't right in the head, how maybe I'd slipped the poison in when he wasn't looking, The desperation in his voice was palpable. He was flailing, grasping at straws, trying anything to shift blame away from himself. I stood up calmly and walked over to where they were all standing. I looked DeAndre directly in the face, keeping my voice steady and cold, and I asked him what my motive would be. What reason would I have to kill his secretary? Or was he afraid they'd discover that the stew wasn't meant for Brianna at all? That it was meant for me? DeAndre's eyes went wide. His mouth opened and closed. He stammered something incoherent, something about me talking nonsense, but the damage was done. Everyone in that hallway heard me. Everyone understood what I was saying, and everyone could see the guilt written all over DeAndre's face. The waiting continued, hour after agonizing hour. We were told to stay at the hospital until the forensic lab results came back, until they could test the food, test Brianna's blood, piece together exactly what happened and when. I sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair, my hand on my stomach, silently promising my baby that I would protect them, that I would make sure justice was served, that their father would pay for what he tried to do. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a forensic technician came out with a folder of results. He approached the officers and they read through the findings together, their faces getting more and more serious. Then the lead officer looked at DeAndre with ice in his eyes and he began to explain what they'd found. Fingerprints on the rim of the container and on the spoon matched mine and Brianna's. That was consistent with our statements. But the crucial finding was that the misoprostol was completely dissolved in the stew. It had been mixed thoroughly into every piece of meat, every drop of juice. The drug had been added during the cooking process while the stew was still very hot, stirred in carefully to ensure even distribution. It wasn't sprinkled on top. It wasn't added later. It was cooked into the food from the beginning, which meant I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have added poison to a sealed container of already prepared stew and somehow made it dissolve perfectly throughout every ingredient. The only person who could have done that was the person who cooked the stew in the first place, the person who'd admitted to preparing it alone, without anyone else touching it from start to finish. DeAndre. I watched the color drain from his face again, watched his confident, accusatory posture crumble, watched him realize that his own story had just destroyed him, his insistence that he'd prepared everything himself, that no one else had touched it, had just proven his guilt beyond any doubt. He started rambling, losing control. He insisted it couldn't be true, that maybe Brianna had taken the medicine herself. Yes, that was it. She was pregnant, she wanted an abortion, she took pills before eating the food. The officers needed to investigate her, not him. He wasn't guilty. He was innocent. They were accusing an innocent man. The desperation was pathetic. He was grasping at anything, throwing out wild theories that made no sense. And I just stood there watching him spiral, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. This was the man I'd loved. This was the man I'd married. This coward who couldn't even face the consequences of his actions with dignity. I cut through his rambling with a voice sharp as glass. I told him to stop. I asked if Brianna had taken medicine on her own, then why was it also dissolved in the stew? Was he going to say she took it and then vomited into the thermal container? Did his explanation sound logical to anyone with half a brain? DeAndre spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He told me to shut up, asked what I knew, said I hated him, that I wanted to destroy him, that I'd staged this whole thing, that it was me. I'd somehow slipped poison into the food when he wasn't looking, and now I was trying to frame him. Even the younger police officer shook his head at that. The lead detective closed his folder and looked at DeAndre with cold, professional disgust. He told DeAndre that his statement contradicted the forensic evidence in multiple ways, that they needed him to come down to the station to clarify some things, that they'd be requesting his car's dashcam footage and the security camera footage from his home kitchen to verify his cooking process. The moment DeAndre heard the word cameras, he jolted like he'd been electrocuted. His face went white. And I knew right then that he'd been stupid enough to leave evidence, that somewhere on those cameras was footage of him carefully measuring out poison and stirring it into my breakfast. Evidence that would put him away for decades. His initial confidence evaporated completely. The mask of the successful executive, the respectable husband, the victim of false accusations, it all fell away. Standing there was just a criminal caught in his lies, a murderer about to face justice. The officer told DeAndre they'd need him to accompany them to the station now. They weren't arresting him yet, but they strongly suggested he cooperate fully. DeAndre's lawyer would meet them there. It was all very professional, very by the book. But we all knew what this was. He was a suspect, the prime suspect, possibly the only suspect. I stood up straight, smoothed my clothes, looked at my husband for what I knew would be one of the last times, and I told him he'd once said that Stu was full of his love. That now I understood his love actually smelled like poison. That luckily, fate had decided our child wouldn't share the same fate as Brianna's baby. That our daughter would live, despite his best efforts to murder her. The word daughter made him flinch. His family's obsession with male heirs, with sons, with carrying on the family name, it had driven so much of his resentment toward me. He'd assumed if I got pregnant, it would be a girl, worthless to him, a disappointment. So he'd tried to eliminate the problem before it could even be born. But he'd killed his own son instead, the male heir he'd wanted so badly, the boy Brianna had been carrying, gone because of his own poison, because of his own evil. And now he'd spend the next decades in prison knowing he'd murdered the child he'd actually wanted while failing to kill the one he didn't. I turned my back on him and walked away, left him standing there in that cold hospital hallway with officers on either side, his future crumbling around him. I walked out into the late afternoon sun, got in my car, and drove away from that nightmare. I didn't go home. I couldn't face that empty house, that bed we'd shared, the ghost of our failed marriage haunting every room. Instead, I went to my office, my sanctuary, the place I'd built with my own hard work and talent. I called Keisha and told her I needed every piece of security footage we had, every camera angle, every timestamp. I needed to know exactly where DeAndre had been that morning, what he'd done, who he'd talked to. Because I knew he hadn't acted alone. He wasn't smart enough or brave enough to pull this off by himself. Keisha delivered within an hour. She brought her laptop to my office, closed the door, and showed me what she'd found. And it was damning. DeAndre's car had entered the parking garage at 7:15 that morning, but he didn't come to my office until 8:15, an entire hour missing. Where was he? What was he doing? The cameras in the garage showed him parking, taking something out of his trunk, a shopping bag, and then disappearing into the stairwell instead of taking the elevator. Keisha had pulled footage from the basement level, and there he was, DeAndre in a white t-shirt wearing a baseball cap pulled low, almost like he was trying to hide his face from cameras. He was carrying a black trash bag, walking quickly toward the dumpster area, but he didn't use the regular trash cans. He went all the way to the back, to the loading dock where the industrial dumpsters were kept, and he threw that bag deep into one of them, looked around nervously, and then rushed back inside. What was in that bag? Medicine packaging? Gloves? Evidence of what he'd done? Keisha told me the garbage truck had already come that morning. The dumpsters were empty now. But she had a theory. She'd sent someone to follow DeAndre's cousin Marcus, who worked in the building as a janitor. She knew Marcus was loyal to DeAndre, that they were close, that Marcus would do anything DeAndre asked. And sure enough, 2 hours after Brianna's collapse, cameras caught Marcus going to that same dumpster area, retrieving something, walking quickly to his car with a black bag similar to the one DeAndre had thrown away. Marcus was getting rid of evidence, hiding it somewhere off-site where it couldn't be traced back to them. I had Keisha send me copies of everything, every video clip, every screenshot. I saved them to 3 different cloud drives, sent copies to my lawyer, because I knew this was my ammunition. This was what would destroy DeAndre completely. But I needed more. I needed to understand the full scope of his betrayal. So I had Keisha pull financial records. It took her some time. She had to get creative, access files she probably shouldn't have touched. But she found it. And when she showed me, I felt my heart break all over again. DeAndre had been paying for Brianna's apartment, a luxury 2-bedroom in Buckhead, one of the most expensive areas in Atlanta, $3,200 a month in rent, plus HOA fees, plus utilities. The lease wasn't in Brianna's name. It was under some shell company called DMJ Consulting LLC, and the legal representative of that company was Marcus, DeAndre's cousin, his accomplice. The money for that apartment came from a slush fund DeAndre had created under business expenses. He'd been funneling company money to pay for his mistress's lifestyle, thousands of dollars every month, while I wore 3-year-old dresses and carried a purse from Target because he always complained about our finances, about how we needed to save, about how the company was struggling. All lies, all manipulation. So he could live 2 lives, have 2 women, 1 wife at home to maintain his respectable image, and 1 mistress in Buckhead to fulfill his desires. Keisha showed me more: bank statements, credit card bills, designer handbags purchased for Brianna, $2,000 each, jewelry from Tiffany's, dinners at expensive restaurants, trips to Miami and Las Vegas charged as business travel. Every penny documented, every lie recorded in black and white. And then there were the medical records. Keisha's contact in the building admin had found something. Brianna had visited a private OB/GYN clinic 2 weeks ago. She knew she was pregnant. She'd known for at least 2 weeks. And DeAndre probably knew too, which meant he'd been planning this for weeks, planning to kill my baby while Brianna was carrying his, planning to divorce me once I'd conveniently miscarried so he could start fresh with his young mistress and their child. Except it all went wrong. The wrong woman ate the poison, the wrong baby died, and now his whole empire of lies was collapsing. I sat in my office looking out at the Atlanta skyline as the sun set in shades of orange and red. My phone buzzed. A text from DeAndre. "Baby, where are you? I just got out of questioning. I'm exhausted. They asked me 1,000 things. My head hurts. Can we talk?" The audacity, the absolute audacity of this man to text me like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just tried to murder me hours earlier, like I was supposed to comfort him because the police had the nerve to question him about his attempted murder. I knew I should ignore it. I knew my lawyer would tell me not to respond, but I couldn't help myself. I texted back, playing the scared wife. "I'm at the office. I'm so scared, DeAndre. Everyone is whispering about me. Are you okay? Did they give you trouble?" His response came quickly. He was fine, he said. Innocent people had nothing to fear. He was just worried about me. Didn't want me thinking crazy things. I should stay calm, go to my mother's house, not listen to rumors. He'd fix everything. Fix everything. Like this was some minor problem that could be smoothed over with his charm and lies. Like my trust hadn't been shattered beyond repair. Like he hadn't revealed himself as a monster. I told him of course I trusted him, that I'd come home later tonight, that I had some work to finish first. And then I blocked his number. I didn't want to hear from him again unless it was through lawyers. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed at a hotel near the airport, too afraid to go home, too wired to rest. My mind kept replaying everything. The smile on DeAndre's face when he brought me that breakfast, the panic when I gave it to Brianna, the rage when she collapsed instead of me, the hatred in his eyes when he realized I'd survived. How long had he hated me? How long had he been planning this? Was it weeks, months? Had he lain next to me in bed at night, thinking about ways to kill me? Had he smiled at me over dinner while fantasizing about my death? How do you share your life with someone who secretly wants you dead? And Brianna, what about her? Did she know? Was she part of the plan? Or was she just another victim, a mistress who got pregnant and became a liability? The police would question her when she woke up. They'd find out what she knew and when she knew it. My phone buzzed again. My lawyer. He'd received the security footage from Keisha. He'd reviewed everything, and he told me in no uncertain terms that I had enough evidence to bury DeAndre, that I should file for divorce immediately, that I should also file for a restraining order, that a man who'd tried to kill me once would try again, that I needed protection. He was right. I knew he was right. But part of me wanted to wait, wanted to watch DeAndre squirm, wanted to see how much deeper he'd dig his own grave before I delivered the final blow. Over the next few days, I watched DeAndre try to control the narrative. He spread rumors throughout the company that I was mentally unstable, that I'd been jealous of Brianna, that I'd been making accusations about an affair that didn't exist, that I'd snapped under pressure and tried to poison my competition. His cousin Marcus helped, whispering in break rooms, planting seeds of doubt about my sanity and innocence. Brianna's mother arrived from Mississippi, a small, worn-down woman named Miss Carolyn who'd worked as a housekeeper her whole life. She'd taken a Greyhound bus for 18 hours to get to Atlanta, bringing bags of home-cooked food and clothes for her daughter. I met her at the bus station. I couldn't let her arrive alone, confused, in a big city she didn't know. I took her to a clean but modest hotel near the hospital, paid for her room for a week. She kept thanking me, kept saying she didn't understand what had happened, that Brianna was a good girl who worked hard and never caused trouble. She said Brianna called her every week, sent her $100 a month for medicine, told her she lived in free company housing and was doing well. $100 a month while living in a $3,200 apartment. Free company housing while sleeping with the boss. Miss Carolyn had no idea who her daughter had become. No idea about the luxury lifestyle, the designer bags, the affair with a married man. She thought Brianna was just a hard-working secretary saving money and staying humble. I had to tell her. I felt cruel doing it, but she needed to know. I gently mentioned that Brianna lived in an expensive apartment in Buckhead, that I'd seen her carrying designer items that cost thousands of dollars, that someone had been taking care of her financially, someone who was married. Miss Carolyn's face crumbled. She covered her mouth with her work-roughened hands and just stared at me in disbelief. She didn't want to believe it. What mother would? But I could see the truth sinking in, the pieces coming together, all those expensive things Brianna had shown off on social media, all the stories that didn't quite add up. I left her in that hotel room and I felt terrible. She was a good woman, a hard-working mother who'd sacrificed everything to give her daughter opportunities, and her daughter had thrown it away for designer bags and a married man's attention. The next morning, Miss Carolyn showed up at the company. She came during lunch hour when the lobby was packed with employees. She stood in the middle of that marble floor in her worn church clothes and old sneakers, and she screamed. Screamed for DeAndre to come down and face her. Screamed that he'd destroyed her baby, that he'd ruined her daughter's life and now had the nerve to call her crazy. Security tried to escort her out gently, but she wouldn't go. She was crying and shouting about justice, about rich men who used poor girls and threw them away, about how her daughter would never be a mother now because of what he'd done. Every employee in that lobby heard her. Every person walking by on the street heard her. And when DeAndre finally appeared, trying to calm her down, trying to quiet her, she threw an envelope of money in his face. $5,000 in cash. He'd sent it to her, trying to buy her silence, trying to pay her off so she'd take Brianna back to Mississippi and disappear. But Miss Carolyn wasn't for sale. She threw those bills at him, and they scattered across the lobby floor like leaves. She told him she'd rather die than take his dirty money, that she'd report him to every police station, every news outlet, every church in Atlanta, until someone listened to her. DeAndre just stood there surrounded by money while everyone watched. His reputation was in tatters. His carefully constructed image of the respectable executive was burning down, and he couldn't do anything about it because every word Miss Carolyn said was true. I watched from the mezzanine hidden behind a pillar, and I smiled. This was karma. This was the universe balancing the scales. That evening, I went home for the first time since the poisoning. Our house, the house we'd bought together 5 years ago, filled with wedding photos and anniversary gifts and dreams of a future that would never happen. I walked through the rooms, feeling like a ghost in my own life. Everything here was tainted now, poisoned by DeAndre's lies. He was there, sitting in the living room with a glass of whiskey. He looked like hell. Unwashed hair, days of stubble, eyes red and swollen. He didn't even look up when I walked in, just took another drink and muttered about what a show I must have enjoyed today, about being humiliated by some country woman in front of all the employees, about how satisfied I must be. I didn't respond. I just put my purse down and stood there, looking at the stranger who used to be my husband. He finally looked up, and there was something in his eyes, something dangerous. He stood up slowly and told me I had to come to the hospital tomorrow, that we needed to present a united front, that he was bringing me a glass of warm milk, that I looked thin and needed to eat better. He went to the kitchen. I heard him moving around, heard the microwave hum, and then he came back with a glass of milk, steam rising from it. He held it out to me with this weird, tight smile, told me it was imported milk, very expensive, good for pregnant women, good for women. The word pregnant hung in the air. He knew. Somehow, he knew I was pregnant. Maybe he'd gone through my things. Maybe he'd found the test I'd hidden. Maybe he'd just guessed. But he knew. And here he was, offering me another drink, another chance to poison me. I took the glass from him, felt the warmth through the ceramic, looked him in the eyes, and I asked him if he remembered the breakfast, the one that nearly killed Brianna, the one he'd also said was made with love. I asked him if he was sure this milk only contained milk. His face changed. The smile disappeared. He stepped back, and I saw fear flash in his eyes. He stammered something about me being paranoid, about him being my husband, about me suspecting him of terrible things. I stood up and walked to the potted plant in the corner of the living room, a beautiful fiddle leaf fig we'd bought together, back when we were happy. I slowly poured that entire glass of milk into the soil, every last drop. And I told DeAndre I didn't suspect him. I just feared this milk might disagree with me the way the breakfast disagreed with Brianna, that the plant needed nutrients too, that we'd see if it was still alive tomorrow. The glass hit the coffee table with a hard crack. DeAndre stared at me with pure terror in his eyes. He knew. He knew that I knew. The pretense was over. The masks were off. We both understood exactly what was happening. This was war, and I wasn't going to be an easy victim. That was the longest night of my life. I locked myself in the guest bedroom, pushed the dresser in front of the door, kept the lights on, kept my phone in my hand, my lawyer on speed dial. I didn't sleep. I just sat there listening for footsteps, for the sound of the doorknob turning, for any sign that DeAndre was coming to finish what he'd started. But he didn't come. In the morning, I heard him leave for work, heard his car pull out of the driveway. I waited another hour to make sure he was really gone. Then I quickly packed a suitcase with my most important documents, some clothes, and every piece of evidence I'd gathered. I walked through the house one last time, looking at the life I was leaving behind, the wedding photos on the wall, the furniture we'd picked out together, the kitchen where we'd cooked meals and laughed and dreamed about growing old together. All of it was poison now. All of it was infected with his betrayal. I wanted none of it. He could have the house, the furniture, the memories. I was taking my life and my baby and my future. That was more than enough. I checked the plant before I left. The fiddle leaf fig he'd watched me pour the milk into. Its leaves were already wilting, already turning brown at the edges. Within a week, that plant would be dead, and I would have been too if I'd drunk that milk. I left the house and never went back. The emergency shareholders meeting was scheduled for the following week. I spent those days preparing like a general preparing for battle. Keisha helped me compile everything into a devastating presentation. Financial records showing the embezzlement, security footage showing DeAndre's suspicious behavior, phone records showing hundreds of calls to an unknown number, screenshots of text messages arranging to meet with his cousin Marcus, and most damning of all, the audio recording. Simone. That was the unknown number. I'd done some digging and found out she was DeAndre's college girlfriend, now a pharmaceutical sales rep living in Birmingham, and she was the one who'd provided the misoprostol. I'd confronted her at a Starbucks in Midtown, showed her the surveillance footage of her handing the package to Marcus in a Target parking lot, told her the police would trace the drug batch back to her, that she'd lose her license, her career, her freedom. She'd broken down crying within 5 minutes, pulled out a flash drive she'd been keeping for insurance, told me everything, that DeAndre had called her weeks ago, crying about how I was pregnant with another man's baby, how he needed to end the pregnancy quietly before it destroyed our marriage, that she'd believed him, that she'd felt sorry for him, that she'd obtained the drug and shipped it to Marcus, thinking she was helping an old friend. But then she'd heard about Brianna's collapse, about the investigation, and she'd realized DeAndre had lied to her, had used her, and now she was terrified he'd throw her under the bus to save himself. I took that flash drive like it was made of gold, promised her that if she testified, if she turned state's evidence, I'd make sure the prosecutor knew she'd been deceived, that she'd get immunity for her cooperation. She agreed immediately. Self-preservation won out over whatever loyalty she'd once felt for DeAndre. On the flash drive was everything. Audio recordings of DeAndre calling her, asking for the drug in his own words. Text messages with the exact dose he wanted. Bank transfers paying her for the favor. And most damning, a recording from after Brianna's hospitalization where DeAndre threatened Simone, told her to keep her mouth shut, warned her that if she said anything about him, he'd make sure she regretted it. I copied everything 3 times, sent it to my lawyer, to the police, to my personal cloud storage. This was checkmate. This was the end of DeAndre's game. The day of the shareholders' meeting, I dressed in my best suit, navy blue and tailored, professional. I did my makeup carefully, calm and composed. I looked in the mirror and I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked strong, powerful. Nothing like the broken, scared woman who'd watched her secretary collapse from poison a week ago. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who'd been forged in fire, someone who wouldn't be a victim, someone who would demand justice. I walked into that boardroom with my head high. The shareholders were already seated, 15 of them, business leaders, investors, people who'd trusted DeAndre to run this company ethically. DeAndre sat at the head of the table in his expensive suit, his power tie, his carefully styled hair. He looked confident, looked like he thought he'd survive this, like he thought his charm and his lies would be enough. He had no idea what was coming. The meeting started with the usual formalities, review of last quarter's numbers, discussion of upcoming projects, and then DeAndre introduced his big proposal, a $2 million investment in some eco-resort project. Fancy name, impressive projections, all the buzzwords investors love to hear. But I knew the truth. This was a scheme to funnel money out of the company before I could touch it in the divorce. This was him trying to hide assets and protect his wealth. He was about to call for a vote when I stood up. Every head in the room turned to look at me. DeAndre's confident smile faltered. I told the shareholders that before we voted on how to spend millions of company dollars, we should discuss whether the person asking for those millions had the moral integrity and legal standing to manage them. DeAndre slammed his hand on the table, told me this was a strategic meeting, not some place to air personal problems. But I didn't sit down. I didn't back down. I told him and everyone in that room that having an affair was personal. Using company money to maintain a mistress was criminal. Creating shell companies to launder funds was criminal. And buying illegal drugs to murder someone was criminal. I said the shareholders deserved to know if their CEO was actually a criminal. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, chairs scraping, everyone talking at once. DeAndre went pale. Started to say something, but I cut him off. I signaled Keisha to connect my laptop to the projector, and then I showed them everything. Bank statements, $3,200 a month to DMJ Consulting LLC for Brianna's apartment, highlighted in red. Thousands more for designer bags, jewelry, trips, all funded with company money under fake expense reports. Then the messages, screenshots of DeAndre texting Marcus about the shell company, about moving money, about hiding assets. The shareholders, even the ones who'd supported DeAndre before, were shaking their heads, frowning, angry at being deceived. I told them this was just financial fraud, that the worst part was still coming. And then I played the audio, Simone's recording. DeAndre's voice filled that boardroom, crystal clear, damning. I need something strong, colorless, odorless, something I can mix in food. I want it to look like a spontaneous miscarriage, clean, that pregnancy is an obstacle. Help me find something that'll do the job right. The silence that followed was deafening. Some shareholders had their hands over their mouths. One woman was crying. An older man looked physically ill. They were hearing a man casually discussing murdering his wife and unborn child. They were hearing him plot murder like it was a business deal. DeAndre jumped up, frantic, trying to rip the cables out of the projector, screaming that it was fake, that I'd manipulated the audio, that this was all lies. But Keisha and 2 security guards I'd arranged to be there stopped him, held him back. And I kept presenting, kept showing them the evidence, the forensic reports, the police statements, the medical records showing Brianna was pregnant when she was poisoned, the DNA test proving it was DeAndre's child. I told them the truth, that the breakfast was meant for me, that I'd given it to Brianna by accident, that if I'd eaten it, I'd be the one in the hospital and my baby would be dead, that DeAndre had tried to murder us and had accidentally killed his own son instead. The shareholders sat in stunned silence. This was beyond anything they'd imagined. This wasn't just financial misconduct. This was attempted murder. This was a monster in a suit who'd smiled and shaken their hands while plotting to kill his wife. I addressed them directly, told them I had all the evidence, that I'd already sent copies to the police, that DeAndre would be arrested, probably within days, that I was proposing his immediate removal as CEO to protect the company's reputation and allow the investigation to proceed, that we needed clean leadership, ethical leadership, leadership that didn't include murder. Someone started clapping, slowly at first, then others joined. It built to applause. I hadn't expected that. I'd expected shock, maybe horror, but not support. But these people, these business leaders, they understood. They understood that I'd just saved the company. That if DeAndre had stayed in power, if this had all come out with him still as CEO, the scandal would have destroyed everything. Stock prices would have crashed. Investors would have fled. The company would have collapsed. I'd done them a favor, and they knew it. The vote was unanimous. DeAndre was removed immediately, stripped of his title, his office, his company car, his stock options, everything. Security was instructed to escort him from the building and collect his key card. He was banned from company property pending the criminal investigation. DeAndre collapsed, literally slid down the wall to the floor, defeated, broken. His perfect plan had exploded in his face, his crime exposed, his victim standing strong while he crumbled. The reversal was complete. And that's when the boardroom doors opened. 2 detectives walked in. I'd called them before the meeting, told them when and where DeAndre would be, made sure they'd be ready. One of them approached DeAndre and told him he was under arrest for attempted murder and drug trafficking. Read him his rights while everyone watched. DeAndre looked at me with those dead eyes one more time, asked me when I'd started planning this, how long I'd been plotting his destruction, why I was being so cruel. We were husband and wife, he said, like that meant something, like our marriage vows should protect him from justice. I walked over to him, looked down at him, slumped on the floor in handcuffs, and I told him I'd started planning this the moment he brought me that breakfast, the moment he tried to kill our baby. That compared to him trying to poison me, sending him to prison was an act of mercy. I told him goodbye, called him my ex-husband, because that's all he was now, all he ever would be again. They took him away. The man I'd loved for 4 years, the man I'd married in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by family and friends, the man I'd trusted with my whole heart, was led out of that boardroom in handcuffs. And I felt nothing. No sadness, no regret, just cold satisfaction that justice was being served. That night, I lay in bed at the hotel. I still couldn't go home. And I played a voicemail my lawyer had forwarded to me. DeAndre calling from the county jail. His voice was broken, desperate. He was begging me to drop the charges, begging me to think about our years together, saying he'd made a mistake, that he'd change, that he'd start over, that he'd make it up to me. Like attempted murder was something that could be forgiven with flowers and apologies. Like he hadn't tried to kill his own child. Like I should prioritize his freedom over my baby's life. I deleted the voicemail, blocked the jail phone number. I was done listening to his lies. The trial came faster than I expected. DeAndre's lawyer tried to get the charges reduced, tried to claim it was a crime of passion, that he'd panicked when he found out I was pregnant, that he deserved leniency. But the prosecutor had everything: the audio recordings, the video footage, the witness testimony from Simone, the forensic evidence, the paper trail of financial crimes. It was airtight, unbeatable. Simone testified in exchange for immunity. She cried on the stand, said she was sorry, that she'd been manipulated, that she'd never imagined DeAndre would use the drug to hurt someone. The jury believed her, saw her as another one of DeAndre's victims. Marcus, DeAndre's cousin, tried to stay loyal at first, tried to cover for him, but when the DA offered him a deal, 5 years probation instead of 15 years in prison, he folded like a cheap tent, testified about everything: how DeAndre had called him that morning, asked him to help dispose of evidence, promised him money if he kept quiet, how DeAndre had threatened him if he talked. Marcus threw DeAndre under the bus to save himself. Brianna never testified. She was still recovering, still dealing with the physical and emotional trauma. But her medical records spoke for themselves: the drug in her system, the miscarriage, the permanent damage to her uterus. The prosecutor played the 911 call from our office. You could hear her screaming in the background, hear the panic in everyone's voices, hear the moment someone realized she was bleeding out. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, came back with a verdict: guilty on all charges: attempted murder, distribution of controlled substances, embezzlement. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, no parole for at least 10. DeAndre's face went white when he heard the sentence. 15 years. He'd be in his 50s when he got out. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His life as he knew it was finished. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to see him in that orange jumpsuit standing before the judge. I didn't need closure from watching him cry and beg for mercy. I'd already gotten my closure. He was out of my life. He'd never hurt me or my baby again. That was enough. 6 months after the trial, I gave birth. It was a difficult labor, 14 hours of pain and fear and pushing. But when they finally put my daughter on my chest, when I heard her first cry, when I looked into her tiny, perfect face, every moment of suffering was worth it. I named her Serenity, because after the storm I'd survived, peace was all I wanted for her. Peace and safety and a life free from the darkness that had almost consumed us both. Looking at her sleeping in my arms at the hospital, I thought about Brianna's baby, the little boy who never got a chance to live, who died because his father was a monster. I thought about how that could have been my daughter, how I came within inches of losing her, how one decision, one moment of following my instinct had saved her life. The newspapers called it luck, called me lucky to have escaped. But it wasn't luck. It was something deeper, some primal maternal instinct that screamed danger when DeAndre walked into my office that morning, some protective force that made me give that food away. I don't know what to call it. Divine intervention, maybe, or just a mother's love that existed even before I knew I was going to be a mother. 2 years passed. Serenity grew into a beautiful, happy toddler. She has my eyes and my smile. She has none of her father's darkness. She runs through my office, playing with her toys while I work. I'm the CEO now. Took over after DeAndre's arrest. Under my leadership, the company has thrived. Profits up 30%. Employee satisfaction at an all-time high. We're ethical now. Clean. No more shell companies or hidden funds or financial crimes. I rebuilt everything DeAndre destroyed. The company's reputation, my own reputation, my life, my future. Brianna recovered physically, but never emotionally. She moved back to Mississippi with her mother. Last I heard, she was working at a small office in her hometown, living quietly, trying to forget what happened. She reached out to me once, sent me a letter apologizing, saying she was young and stupid and seduced by a married man's attention, that she'd never forgive herself for what she'd lost, for what she'd helped DeAndre do. I never responded. Part of me sympathized with her. She was a victim, too. But another part of me couldn't forget that she'd flaunted the affair, that she'd deliberately tried to make me jealous, that she'd participated in breaking up my marriage. that she'd been carrying DeAndre's baby while he was trying to murder mine. So I let her letter go unanswered, let her live with her regret. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't revenge either. It was just nothing. She meant nothing to me anymore. DeAndre writes me letters from prison. At first they were angry, blaming me, calling me vindictive, saying I'd set him up, that I'd destroyed his life over a misunderstanding, over a mistake. I burned those letters, didn't even read them all the way through. Then the letters changed, became pleading, desperate, apologizing, saying he was sorry, that he'd been wrong, that he missed me and Serenity, that he wanted a chance to be a father, that he'd found God in prison and changed his ways, that I should bring Serenity to visit him, let him meet his daughter. I burned those letters too. Serenity doesn't have a father. She has me. She has my mother who helps me with childcare. She has Keisha, who's become like an aunt to her. She has a whole network of people who love her and protect her. She doesn't need a man who tried to kill her before she was born, who only wants a relationship now because he's lonely and desperate and has nothing left. My mother asked me once if I felt guilty, if I felt bad about sending my husband to prison, about Serenity growing up without a father. I told her no. I told her I felt like I'd killed a monster and saved my daughter, that DeAndre made his choices, that he brought poison into our lives, and I'd simply made sure justice was served, that Serenity was better off with no father than with one who'd view her as a disappointment because she wasn't the son he wanted. My mother nodded, understood. She'd seen the evidence, heard the recordings. She knew what DeAndre was, and she agreed that Serenity was lucky. Lucky that her mother had been strong enough to survive, smart enough to see through the lies, brave enough to bring a monster to justice. On Serenity's second birthday, I took her to the park. We fed the ducks. She laughed and ran through the grass. The sun was shining, the sky was clear and blue, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. Not just content or okay, actually happy, joyful, at peace. That's when I got the text. From a number I didn't recognize, it said, "Hi Maya, this is Elijah. We met at the charity gala last month. I was wondering if you and Serenity might like to join me at the farmer's market this weekend. I'll bring coffee. You bring her sunshine." I'd met Elijah 6 months ago at a fundraiser for children's hospitals. He was an architect, soft-spoken, kind, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile. We talked for hours that night about everything and nothing, about our work, our dreams, our favorite books and movies. He'd asked about Serenity, and his eyes lit up when I showed him pictures. He'd asked if I was married, and when I said I was divorced, he hadn't pushed for details, just nodded and changed the subject. Since then, he'd been texting occasionally. Nothing pushy, just friendly, inviting me to art exhibits or community events, always including Serenity in the invitation. Never trying to rush me into anything, just being present, being patient, being kind. I looked at Serenity playing in the grass, looked at the message on my phone, and I realized I was ready. Ready to open my heart again, ready to let someone in, not because I needed a man, not because Serenity needed a father, but because I deserved happiness, deserved love, deserved a future that wasn't defined by DeAndre's betrayal. I texted back, "We'd love that." That weekend, we met Elijah at the farmer's market in Decatur. He brought coffee like he'd promised. Serenity warmed up to him immediately, holding his hand as we walked through the stalls of fresh produce and handmade crafts. He didn't try to be her father, just let her be herself, made her laugh, bought her a balloon and a popsicle, looked at me like I was someone worth knowing, worth caring about. And for the first time in years, I felt like maybe everything was going to be okay, like maybe the darkness was truly behind me, like maybe I could build something new, something healthy, something real. That's the end of my story, the end of how I survived my husband trying to murder me and came out stronger on the other side. Did it hurt? Yes. Did it break me? For a while. But it didn't destroy me, didn't defeat me, because I'm a survivor, and Serenity is a survivor, and we're going to live our lives in the light, far away from the poison that almost killed us. If you liked this story, Please hit that like button right now and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love hearing from you all across the world. Don't forget to subscribe because I have so many more incredible life stories coming your way. There are 2 amazing stories on your screen right now that I think you'll love. Thank you for your support. See you in the next one. Peace and blessings.